will look
Yeah,
bizarre.
no, exactly.
It's okay.
Bonsoir. Oui. Bonsoir, bonsoir. Merci d'être.
Hello and good evening and welcome to this third lecture by Paul Sidhu, who needs no introduction, but it's always a pleasure reintroducing him to those of you who were not here last time. He will be here for our symposium on the 10th of April, and so I urge you to sign up and attend the symposium. So Paul is a graduate of the University of Cambridge. He was a senior fellow at New York University Central on International Cooperation, professor at the NATO College. He's a consultant with the UN, especially on issues of disarmament and proliferation. And today he's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in New Delhi. And, of course, he's a well-known expert on international relations, especially as regards issues of proliferation, disarmament, and all strategic issues in Asia. And indeed, last week he gave us a presentation on nuclear balance and the issues of nuclear proliferation, a most thought-provoking presentation. And now Mr. Sidhu is proposing to help us understand better India's strategic position. The way it works is, he speaks as long as he likes, probably in an hour. Isabelle Verge and myself will direct the second part of the session where we can put questions and the audience too. Paul, you can, if you prefer to talk standing, feel free.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me back again for the third time. And I'm really honored and privileged to be here not once, twice, but 3 times. And also on such a lovely day outside. So I apologize for keeping you all from enjoying the weather outside, but it shows your dedication and commitment to this course, but also the topic. So I'm very grateful to you for that. The topic we have is India's strategic vision for the 21st century. Now, I know why this topic is of great importance for me. But why is this topic of great importance to you? Why are you here rather than outside enjoying the wonderful weather? Why is India so critical for you? Anyone? Yes. Okay. Question mark. Thank you. Anyone else? Is there a strategic vision of India? Anyone else? Yes.
We're thinking about China, Russia, a lot of countries that have been encouraged.
Okay. So there needs convincing here, a certain degree of conviction. Yes, sir.
But India could be the most populous country for sometimes in the century.
Okay.
As it is developing so far.
Population development.
It will be
okay.
the leaders of the world, isn't it?
Leaders of the world, population development. Anyone else? Any other reasons why we should worry about India? Yes, sir.
That we are always talking about strategic problems about United States, Great Britain, Russia, but never about
India. Okay.
I'm very glad for the first time to hear something.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? especially from the back. Anyone else? Yes, especially the students. Any interest why we should focus in India? Yes. Relations with China. Thank you. Is there anyone else? There's a mic as well there now. Will you just take the last response there? Geography. Thank you. Okay. Now, it's very interesting. Among all the other things that I've heard, one word we haven't we haven't heard yet is democracy. And it's curious, as to why that may be the case and whether, here are different countries separated by the same political system. Democracy in this particular case. But what I'd like to do is perhaps start off with some of maybe what you may consider cliches about India. And, like a lot of cliches, there is a certain degree of truth in those cliches. But I think it's important to deconstruct them to understand it a little better. So let me start with the first point that I sort of made. India is called the world's biggest democracy. It certainly is. But, what does it mean when we say India is the biggest democracy? I've projected some numbers there. So this is the numbers from the last election. 714 million was the size of the electorate in 2009. But what does it mean? It's a number, and after a while, the numbers don't add up to very much. But let me deconstruct it in the following way for you. In 2009, the European Union held elections for the European Parliament members. The total size of that electorate was 375 million, all of European Union, 375 million. In 2012, the United States held its elections for the president. The electorate of the United States was 220 million. If you add those two up, imagine all of the European Union elections being held, as it will be this year, and the American elections, it still works out to 595 million, okay? Let's add Turkey. Let's add Indonesia. And then you come up to the size of 714. And by the way, the 714 was in 2009. New elections are going to be held in less than a month. On the 7th of April, they will begin. The size of the Indian electorate for this particular elections is over 800 million. Okay? So just to give you the contrast, of course it's the biggest democracy, but what does it mean? How big is the democracy, and what are the challenges that you have in trying to lead such a particular democracy? And just to give you again a lot of the statistics which are before there. So the number of people who are on duty just to run the elections is 6.1 million. That is the size of some of the European countries. Just to put it in contrast. So it's a big, huge exercise, a major endeavor. And here I've got some vignettes which again show you some of the challenges in running the Indian election. You have a Muslim woman with a burqa clad who's just given her vote, therefore you can see the ink on her finger, but how do you identify her? Whether she's a legitimate voter or not. On top of that, you have the electronic voting machine, which is again very unique because in 1951, when India held its first elections, it was called the biggest challenge, the biggest democratic gamble in the world. Why? Because all Indians, all adult Indians over a certain age of 21, men or women, educated or otherwise, were given the vote. This, by the way, was 20 years before women got the right to vote in Switzerland. Just to give a contrast, right? And it just shows that this was a huge challenge, a huge gamble that the country took in trying to check and see whether democracy could work, or at least elections could work, in a largely uneducated, illiterate population. It was a successful gamble, but it was a gamble nonetheless. So here again, keeping up with that challenge, you have electronic voting machines, but the idea is also to try and make sure that people who are uneducated and illiterate can also use them. And on your left, you have a photograph of one of these electronic voting machines. You see that small briefcase-sized box being carried on an elephant to an area. The only way you can approach it is by elephant. There are no roads. And so this is some of the kind of challenges that Indian democracy faces going forward. But let me not paint too much of a romantic picture of India's democracy. It does face very, very fundamental challenges. Here is a chart from the Democracy Index of 2012. And it describes Indian democracy as a flawed democracy. It says these are countries that has free and fair elections, but even if there are problems, such as basic civil liberties, are sort of respected, but there are other concerns. Enfranchisement, particularly of women in operational terms, also remains a very big challenge. But the contrast I want to point out is, even though India is a flawed democracy, look at all the countries around India's neighborhood and in India's neighborhood. They range from either authoritarian regimes to, at best, hybrid regimes. So India, even with all its democratic limitations and flaws, really does remain a little bit of a bastion of democracy in its immediate region. Someone talked about the Indian population. Now, not only is the Indian population the second largest in the world, it will probably become the largest at the middle of the century. It is also the most diverse. It has not just the biggest Hindu population, but a very substantive Buddhist and Sikh population, and is also the third largest Muslim country in the world. After Indonesia and Pakistan, India is the third largest Muslim country. And what may be familiar to many of you in the European Union is India, a single country, has 23 official languages. If you take out an Indian currency note, you will see all of the languages listed there. And that poses a really significant sort of challenge. Now, the photographs that I've got here, there are two of them which are quite interesting. One of them on the right is, you may recognize her, on the left, you may recognize her, is Sonia Gandhi, the president of one of the biggest national parties, the Congress Party. She was, of course, born a Roman Catholic and is today a Hindu and an Indian citizen, leading one of the biggest democracies in the world. To the right, you have the President of India, who's the second person from the right there, who's a Hindu, but almost everybody else in that photograph is a minority. To his right is the Vice President of India, who's Hamid Ansari, a Muslim, the Indian Prime Minister, who's a Sikh like me, a minority, and next to him, India's Foreign Minister, Salman Khurshid, again a Muslim. Just to point out that you do have huge diversity, but also that minorities have managed to have something of an impact on the governance and on the strategic thinking of India going forward. Let's move to slightly more familiar territory that many of you would associate with India. India has the world's largest voluntary standing army. And here I want to make a distinction, because India is not the largest army in the world. That distinction goes to North Korea and to Vietnam. also China, but these are not voluntary standing armies. And India's the size of the armed forces is about 1.3 million. India is also the world's largest contributor to the UN peacekeeping. Ever since its inception, it has contributed over 160,000 troops, and including, by the way, a photograph up there on the top right of the first all-women contingent, which was deployed to Liberia. And India has also provided something like 12 force commanders. Now, India roughly spends between 3 to 4% of its GDP on defense. Although in reality, last year, this was only 2.5% of GDP. It was 1/3 of China. 55% of the defense budget goes to the army, 23% to the Air Force, and the Navy takes about 15%, or thereabouts. But if you look at per capita, India's spending on defense is only $14 per capita. This is half of what Pakistan spends on its military, which is 28%, and even less than what China spends, which is $30 per capita. So just to give that to you in contrast. A lesser known area is India's emergence now as I wouldn't necessarily say a space power, but as a space player. And India recently launched on the 5th of January this year its geosynchronous satellite launch vehicle, which really does make it a critical player in satellite launches. And here you can see images of the satellite at the bottom left, and also a flight profile on the bottom right. India's total stock of scientific and technically qualified manpower is estimated around 2.5 million. This makes India the third largest complement of manpower, technical manpower, anywhere in the world. Of course, it has to be said that the quality of this manpower is not all even, and some of it is high and low, and that is a little problematic. Another achievement, just to give you a recent marker, is India launched very recently, in fact just last month, a mission to Mars. Last year, a mission to Mars. Now, this mission may succeed or it may fail. That's not the big story. The big story is that the budget for this mission was $75 million. That is roughly 1/7 of the budget of a NASA project to Mars. It's also, by the way, for those of you who watch Hollywood, less than the budget of the film Gravity. Just to put this into contrast. So what India has been able to do is really do space launches and space missions very, very cheaply, extremely economically until now. Now that may change again, but this is an important role as well. The big story, again, somebody mentioned this, and I'm grateful for that, is the economic growth. Nobody would have taken India seriously unless its economic growth was relevant and significant. Already, the International Monetary Fund has put India as the third largest economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity. After the United States and China, India is considered the third largest. In real terms, India is already the 10th largest economy in the world with a GDP of about $2 trillion. But by 2040, which is quite short in strategic terms, India is likely to become the third largest economy in real terms in the world. Now, despite that, India's per capita is relatively low, and I'll develop this a little bit more. It's only $1,500 per capita, which makes it, by the way, 139 out of 147 countries in the world. Very, very low. But if you look at purchase power parity, then India's per capita in 2012 was actually $4,000 per capita. So a different kind of contrast. Now, India also faces some very unusual challenges, which partly come from the diverse kind of, diversity of its population, but also its very strong sort of religious drivers as well. One of them is, and before I move on from this slide, just to give you an idea that, over the last decade or so, India has certainly maintained a growth above 6%. Only in this decade has it now dropped below 5% already. And this is going to pose a major challenge as to how India sort of, goes forward. But let me turn to some other partly societal but partly governance challenges that India faces as well. Here are two unusual photographs of a location in a city called Allahabad. Now, the average population of the city of Allahabad is 2 million. Allahabad is also the confluence of two Indian rivers, the Ganga and the Yamuna, and it's considered very auspicious in Indian or in Hindu terms. So once every 12 years, there is a very big festival there, and if you bathe in this river, you get absolution, etc., etc. And it is a very major undertaking. Now, I want to just, and I'll stand up for this very briefly. Here are two photographs. This one is a satellite image taken in the year 2000, May of 2000. And you can see how empty it is, and you can also see the color or lack of it there. Is this my... oh, it's there. Okay. I can actually use this. Thank you. Now, the same photograph was taken in January 2001 at the height of this festival. Now, I want you to note a couple of things. Number one, look at all these bridges that have been built. Look at this entire township which has come up. This whole area was empty. This whole township has come up. And by the way, this is a temporary township, right? Because the population of this city will jump up from 2 million to 30 million at that height of that festival, okay? And just one last point here. You see the color in this water here? The red and brown color? Those are people. This is all they're just having a great bath. Now, fortunately, this festival happens only once in 12 years. But to carry out this kind of an accomplishment is a huge challenge, but something that India somehow manages to do, which is quite unusual. And here, just to give you an idea, is a photograph of the temporary bridges which have been built right across, which you can see along this river as well. Okay, let me move on to some other challenges. Now, even though India has a huge growth, is the third largest economy in the world, the 10th largest in real terms, and will become so in 2040, it is also a remarkably poor country. Okay? More than a quarter of India's population, this is about 300 million, live on less than $1 a day. In fact, India is home to 40% of the world's poor. One state alone, Uttar Pradesh, has 8% of the world's poor. And another statistics which really shocked even me. There are 8 very rich resource states in India. They have more poor in those 8 states than 26 of the poorest states in Africa. Okay? Just to give you a contrast. Now, mind you, there has been major strides made in poverty reduction. Since 1990, when the economic reforms began, poverty has actually declined by about 20%. But clearly, it's not enough. Much, much more still needs to be done. And just to give you an idea, again, of how, poverty is visible everywhere, even in the urban centers, I've taken this photograph. Now, this particular runway is the main runway of Mumbai International Airport, right? So this is where the world meets India. Right next to that, right here, is the biggest slum in Asia called Dharavi. Okay? Here is another image of that slum, and just to show you, you can see on the top here the wing of the aircraft, right? And this is what you will see when you're landing at Mumbai Airport, the biggest slum in Asia. Okay, so this again poses, just to give you a contrast of a very rich India, but also a very poor India. Another element, another point to highlight is, according to the Human Development Index in 2013, India actually ranks very, very poorly in terms of income, health, and literacy. It is only 136 out of 186 countries. It's the lowest among Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa, among the BRICS countries. Its gender equality ratio is the worst in South Asia, except for one country, Afghanistan. So it is not certainly something for India and Indians to be proud of. Now, you have heard and you will hear more about the external challenges that India faces. But one of the biggest challenges that India is facing today is internal. Here are some of the areas which are overrun by the Maoist or the Naxalite threat. All of them are internal, and the irony is that these are some of the richest states in mineral wealth in the world, and in India. According to some estimates, the minerals in this area are about $1 trillion worth. And yet, these are among the poorest states in India, and they're also the state with internal security threats and concerns, right? So this poses another very significant challenge. The areas which are in red are the worst affected, and the others are less so. But they certainly are an important internal security challenge that India faces as well. Let's turn to corruption. Now, here is an index. A map provided by Transparency International, and you can see, in contrast to the earlier map I showed on democracy, how poorly India does in terms of corruption. It is almost as bad as all of its neighbors, if not worse. And India ranks 94 out of 177 countries. So really not something that India needs to be proud of. Let me also then turn to another and the last of these slides. India is also on the failed state index, which looks at how many states in the world are on the verge of failing. Now, among the top 30 states, many of the states which are on the verge of failing are actually in South Asia. India is not so badly placed. It's at 79 out of 178. But nonetheless, it's also seen as a state under some degree of threat and crisis. And I just wanted to flag that to you as well. So, just completing my tour de force of India and why we should bother with India, there are obviously some highlights that I've pointed out. But India's per capita GDP is the lowest among all the G20 countries. In fact, it is 50% lower than the next lowest country, which is Indonesia. India even today has fewer doctors and nurses than the standard WHO benchmark. India has only 900 diplomats worldwide. This is the same number as small countries like Singapore and New Zealand. And I've already mentioned the gender inequality index, where India ranks extremely poorly. And last but not least, some of you may be aware of the instances of rape which have been coming up in India and have forced the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillai, to actually call rape a national problem in India. And so this poses the kind of sets of challenges that India faces as a country. So let me now, with this kind of very quick overview, turn to the outline really of my presentation to try and sort of say, how then can we try and understand India's grand strategy against this sort of background? And here I'd like to do the following, maybe over the next 40 minutes or so, perhaps. Thank you. So I want to begin a little bit with India's history and its geopolitics and how that has influenced India's outlook, global outlook, but also its strategic outlook. I'll talk a little bit about India's colonial legacy and how it emerged as a weak hegemon in the particular region. I'll then turn to war and peace in South Asia, but this will largely be external. India's relations both with China, but also with Pakistan. I'll then turn to what are the challenges that India faces at the moment, both internal and external. How can we understand and explain them? And then I will sort of look at how India is trying to address those challenges. So India looks at the world now in three strategic circles. They're not very neat, but they provide a point of view. And the three strategic shifts that India has undergone to try and adjust to the new world. I will then try and conclude with two elements. One, talk about one perception or presentation of a grand strategy, which was made by the Prime Minister quite recently, and then sort of look at the future prospects of India and India's possibility of being a rule shaper in the emerging world order. So, and the reason why I need to follow this structure is that unfortunately India doesn't, Indian officialdom does not have a very clearly articulated security policy or a strategic policy. There is no white paper. There is no common foreign and security policy or even a security and defense policy. So what you really need to do is infer, you need to deduct the Indian grand strategy from a various sort of statements and various perspectives and points of view. All right. So let me start with the key factors in trying to identify India's role in geopolitical terms. First of all is its location between the Gulf, and this will become clear in the maps that I show, and the Strait of Malacca. Its long borders, but also its huge coastline, and its very dominant position in the Indian Ocean. The second element that I want to point out is, again, it's a cliche to talk about India's rich history, which goes back to 5,000 years, but it's also gone through an experience of colonial history and the Cold War. And all of these have had a very important impact on India's outlook to the world. The third element that I want to talk about, or certainly, refer to in passing, is the culture. And here in particular, I want to draw your attention to the strategic culture of India. And what is unusual about the strategic culture of India is that India has very much attracted foreigners in different ways, either as invaders, as explorers, as visitors, as early as 326 BC. One of the first ones to come on the Indian shores was Alexander of Macedonia. And ever since then, India has had this attraction to the rest of the world. But here is what is very curious. We do not hear of Indian empires expanding beyond the Indian subcontinent. And we certainly do not hear of Indian empires expanding militarily beyond its immediate neighborhood. Which is again very curious, because what you hear about is the spread of Indian culture. You hear about the spread of Buddhism or even Hinduism, both of which, of course, are Indian religions, but none of them was spread through the tip of the sword. They were all spread, in other ways, and this is almost a classic use of soft power, if you like. but over the centuries. And so, why has that happened is one of the big mysteries that I think we still need to look at when we examine and try to understand India's grand strategy even in the 21st century. India's economy has also changed very, very dramatically over the centuries. I won't go back 5,000 years. I'll start from 1500 and you'll see why. But it has then gone through a state-controlled economy, the license Raj economy in the 1950s, and then has moved to a liberal market economy in the 1990s. And militarily also, India has now shifted quite significantly from a traditional land-based force to a modern three-dimensional nuclear force with a greater emphasis on the maritime focus. Okay? Just to share with you the map and to show that, look at the way, and the reason why I've mentioned Southern Asia rather than South Asia, because India's immediate geostrategic space goes from the Gulf in the west all the way down to the Strait of Malaccas in the east, or you may even say South China Sea increasingly, right down to the Indian Ocean, even below this, and all the way up to Central Asia. So all of this is of great strategic interest to India. Now, if you look at the map, if you look at this map, what becomes very obvious is the space that India occupies there, right? It accounts for 72% of the territorial area, 77% of the population, 78% of all the regional natural resources. And there's no doubt that's why India does dominate this region. Now, another interesting facet. Many of you had heard of the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, SAARC, which is the South Asian countries like the European Union, but no comparison to the European Union in terms of effectiveness. Very recently, Afghanistan has joined that SAARC grouping of countries. But before Afghanistan joined SAARC, here is a very peculiar notion of SAARC. All the SAARC countries, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives, none of them shared a border with each other. They all shared a border with India. Okay, so you can just see the way that India dominates even the one regional organization. Now with the entry of Afghanistan, yes, Pakistan and Afghanistan share a border, which by the way they dispute. That's a different issue. But this is one of the challenges of how you try and address the peculiarity of India's dominance of the region. The second is the trade routes. Now this is a map showing the trade routes from 1000 BC. Now, the method of plying the oceans has changed, but the trade routes have more or less remained the same. Now, what I want to point out here is the following. Number one, 90% of India's trade is by sea. And if you look at the value of India's trade, then nearly 80% of that is by sea. So the sea is extremely critical to India's strategic past, present, and certainly future. Just to give you a few statistics, many of you know, of course, of the Strait of Hormuz here. Many of you know of the Strait of Malaccas. But very few of you may have heard of what is known as the 9-degree channel. This comes just on the side of India here, and that alone has 60,000 ships traversing every year. Okay? So, and something like, the bulk of the world's oil and gas traverses through this entire area. And you can look at the location of India in that central region to ensure the supply of oil and gas remains absolutely vital in this particular area. India also was one of the big beneficiaries of the laws of the sea. And just to give you an idea of the range of and the area of India's exclusive economic zone, gives you a tremendous idea of how important the maritime element has become to India. Just to point out two factors, here is the Lakshadweep Islands, which is where the 9-degree channel comes from, and here are the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. some of them, this particular one, Point Indira, is actually closer to Indonesia than it is to the Indian mainland. And so that again poses a very important critical sort of strategic challenge as to how do you deal with these territories which are way away from the mainland, and how do you sort of address them. Let me now turn to this graph. There was a British historian, economist by the name of Angus Maddison, who worked for the OECD. And he did a history of the global economy from the year 1 AD onwards. And he's drawn this chart, and it's quite interesting. And the reason I share it with you is it has an important contribution to India's strategic development as well. In the year 1500, two countries accounted for 50% of the global GDP. China and India. Okay? The rest of the world, although Europe is listed here as 20%, but the rest of the world accounted for the rest 50%. Okay? Over a period of time, as the European explorers set out to the world and then subsequently colonized the world, traders and then colonized the world, and the Industrial Revolution began, you see a very dramatic fall in the share of both China but also India. And in fact, a dramatic fall comes in a period of just 50 years, from 1820 to 1870. Any idea why that might have happened? There was almost one incident that led to this dramatic fall. Industrial Revolution is one. But the second is the Opium Wars. It was the Indian opium which was being shipped to China to pick up tea from there to bring back. And you see a very dramatic fall, particularly in the case of China, between 1870 and 1820. Right? But what's even more significant is that by the time of India's independence in 1947, India's share of the global GDP was, guess how much? 4%. Okay? And so one of the things that India really wants to do is try to go back up to the 1500 level. And that's one of the big strategic challenges that India has set for itself. Okay? Now, let me turn very quickly to the colonial legacy. Now, everybody talks about the colonial legacy only in negative terms, and I don't want to do that because I think there were some values, some notions, some ideas which India certainly picked up from the colonial experience, which are significant. The first of them was the notion of the European Enlightenment, but more importantly, the Western liberal democracy, right? And leading up to the Westminster model, which India was then able to imbibe. But there are two other rather more negative connotations of the colonial legacy which still sort of haunt India and India's future. The first was the two-nation theory. And here I'll have to spend a little bit of time trying to explain if that's all right, Professor Gautier. During the time of India's independence movement, there were two schools of thought which came up in the process of that liberation movement. One was led by the Indian National Congress, led by people like Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and others, who argued and thought of India as a secular, multicultural, multi-ethnic nation, where all the minorities and majority could coexist, cohabitate in the same political space. This notion was challenged by another party called the Muslim League, which was led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, among others. But Muhammad Ali Jinnah is a name that you might recognize. And they argued that it was not possible for the Muslims of the subcontinent to coexist politically in the same political space with a Hindu majority. and that the Muslims of the subcontinent would need a separate homeland for themselves, right? That this was very important, and this was the concept of the two-nation theory. So that you needed two nations, one for the Hindus and others of the region, but others for the Muslims of the region. This was a big debate, and the Muslim League argument won. And because of that, it led to the partition of India into India and Pakistan, but also a very strange partition on the part of Pakistan, which is almost untenable. In fact, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, when Pakistan was created into West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which is modern-day Bangladesh, he actually called it a moth-eaten state, separated by hostile India in between. And even he thought it was going to be quite a big challenge on how this was going to be governed. Now, many of the issues that India faces today come from that concept of the two-nation theory even today, and perhaps the most critical of that is Kashmir. And I'll spend a few minutes talking a little bit about Kashmir. The second problem with the colonial legacy was the poorly demarcated borders. The first was between India and Pakistan. This was demarcated by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who, by the way, had never visited India except for the 2 weeks to draw this line. And in many places, the line goes through the same village, and the villages have been divided. But this is not the only problem. The similar problem was with the India-China border by Sir Henry McMahon, and this was drawn in 1914. The Chinese, even till this date, have never accepted this border. And this has again been part of the problem because this has led to one of the most serious border disputes anywhere in the world. I mentioned that I was going to talk about India's wars in the region. I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want to list them out for you. But I will focus on one or two of them. I will talk a little bit about the Kashmir War, the first one, because this is an important element going forward. I will also talk about the India-China war. That is an important aspect in the relationship of these two countries going forward. But the other wars I just want to list there for your reference. Just to say that there have been quite a few wars that India has been involved in with its neighbors, and this is just to give you a list. But let me move very, very quickly to the Kashmir War, because this is the first Kashmir War in 1947-48, because this is an important part of the narrative. Now, on the 14th of August, 1947, this is what united Jammu and Kashmir looked like. It was one of over 500 princely states. Now, under the Treaty of Accession, as part of the instrument of independence, there was a Treaty of Accession. All these 500 states, which, by the way, form part of India and Pakistan, had three options. One, they could choose to join India. Second, they could choose to join Pakistan. Third, they could choose to remain independent. Okay? Now, many of the other states were so entrenched in Indian or Pakistani territory, there was no question that they would join the other state, right? But Kashmir posed a very particular challenge. Why? First of all, Kashmir was a Muslim majority state, but it was ruled by a Hindu ruler. Okay? Number one. Second, as you can see from this map, Kashmir is the one state which abuts both Pakistan here and India. So it could quite easily go to either side, right? Third, look at the location of Kashmir. You know, it abuts Afghanistan, its border with China. It's of great strategic value, right? But the most important factor why Kashmir was so important for both India and Pakistan is the two-nation theory, right? Now, for India, it was very important that Kashmir, a Muslim-majority state, join secular, multicultural, multi-ethnic India to underline the point that a Muslim-majority state could coexist in India. precisely for the same reason, it was very important for Pakistan to show that Kashmir could not coexist with a Hindu majority India. So, a lot of people have argued that Kashmir is really about territory. I have often argued that Kashmir is about ideology. It's about the concept and the notion of what kind of a state that you want to have, right? Now, the story of Kashmir becomes even more bizarre in 1947. Soon after, to continue the story, so the independent India and independent Pakistan go to the ruler of Kashmir, who is, as I said, a Hindu by the name of Hari Singh, and tell him, why don't you join us? And he says, I haven't made up my mind. So he signs what is known as a standstill agreement. He says, I need time out. I can't decide. So go away. Give me some time. I'll decide and I'll let you know. Thank you very much. Now, in the meantime, from this area, from the northwest frontier provinces, tribesmen cross into Jammu and Kashmir and they lay siege and they attack and they come into Jammu and Kashmir and they lay siege on Srinagar, which is the capital of independent Jammu and Kashmir. At this point, the Hindu ruler of Kashmir panics and he turns to India and says, listen, you've got to help me. We've got these invaders come in and they've taken over my, the territory here. You have to help me get rid of them. India says, look, we'd love to help you, but you're not part of India. So I'm sorry, we cannot spare troops. But if you join India, then maybe you can. So in October of 1947, which is one of the most controversial agreements even today, and one of the most disputed agreements, he signs the Treaty of Accession, formally joining India. Okay? At that point of time, India then very quickly moves its troops, liberates, and by the way, the tribesmen now are replaced by Pakistani troops, right? And you'll see in the next map, there is where the fighting stops is where you have the line of control. Now, in the meantime, the Indian Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, goes to the United Nations and hopes that the United Nations will condemn Pakistan as the invader and ask them to withdraw. Instead, the United Nations in its wisdom calls for a plebiscite, which makes India totally panic, right? And India says there's no way we're going to allow for that because that vote would not have gone in India's favor in 1947. Instead, the United Nations calls for a ceasefire, which both India and Pakistan accept. And by the way, this is the interesting, bizarre part of the story. The ceasefire is accepted by India, or on behalf of India, by Field Marshal Claude Alchinac, a British Field Marshal who was in command of the Indian forces. The ceasefire is also accepted on behalf of Pakistan by Field Marshal Claude Alchinac, who's also the Field Marshal of the Pakistani forces. So it was the same Field Marshal who accepted the ceasefire on both sides. So today, this is what Jammu and Kashmir looks like. So this is where the 1949 ceasefire line is drawn, and that is where, so this area is now under Pakistan control, and this area is under Indian control, and subsequently, after the India-China war, which I will come to in a minute, this area was taken over by China, and this area has been succeeded by Pakistan to Kashmir. So you can see, how the Kashmir battle itself did not lead to a resolution, but actually complicated the situation even further. Let me very quickly run through the India-China, challenges as well. There were many tensions already rising between India and China in the 1940s, but the border dispute, along with the quote-unquote liberation of Tibet in 1950, was part of the problem. Soon after that, India quite accepted the Tibet, but when the Dalai Lama crossed over in 1959, tensions rose again between India and China. And then in 1962, there was this infamous war between India and China, where where China controlled Aksai Chin, which, by the way, still remains under Chinese control. And the Chinese troops came and occupied a large part of Indian territory, but then also withdrew unilaterally, which is a big shock and challenge for India even today. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that all India did was go to war with all of its neighbors. There were also major efforts, particularly with Pakistan, at trying to ensure some degree of peace. And different methods were tried. No war pact, a confederation, normalizing relations after war, confidence building measures, and since the 1990s, a composite dialogue. Similarly, India has made similar efforts with China, but the one difference is that the efforts with China began quite early on. They were quite successful in 1954, where India and China actually agreed on the Panchshila Agreement, which literally means 5 principles. This was more or less the Chinese perspective of non-interference, and really provided the basis for non-alignment as well. But for a long time, since 1962, there was no real negotiations between India and China until about 1981. And that's when relations started to normalize, but relations really began to normalize after the end of the Cold War. And today, even though the border dispute remains a major hurdle, China and India have really improved their trade relations. And today, their bilateral trade is already crossing or about to cross 100 billion a year. So really quite dramatic sort of change in their relationship, even though the border dispute remains. So I've skipped over a lot of this in the interest of time, but at the end of the Cold War, essentially 2 things are of importance to our narrative here. One is that India begins economic reforms in 1991. And second is defense budgets begin to fall quite dramatically. The reason why India began economic reforms in 1991 was it went bankrupt. And it really needed to do a major restructuring of its economy, but that then subsequently allowed it to look beyond its neighborhood and really become the success story in some ways that we're talking about today. And in the absence of the Cold War, or post-Cold War, India was also able to normalize relations not only with China, but also began a Look East policy, where it began to engage more with the ASEAN countries and build up economic ties going forward there as well. I'm not going to go into much detail about why India went nuclear. We talked about this in the last week's lecture, but just to quickly highlight a few reasons behind India's decision to. There are many, as I said last week as well, India's reason to go nuclear was complex, but I think the end of the Cold War may have played a role in India's decision to go overtly nuclear as well. And for India to go nuclear was also a quest on autonomy in decision making, a notion of strategic autonomy that India talks about as well. But in some ways, India going nuclear has also complicated its relations both with Pakistan and China, and it still needs to build up on a nuclear restraint regime, which it really has not been able to do until now. Let me then turn to the scenario today and look at what are the current challenges that India faces. And I've divided them into 4. One is territorial, the very obvious ones, the territorial disputes between India and Pakistan, but also between India and China. But equally important are the non-territorial challenges. This is, and perhaps primary among them, is how do you maintain the economic growth? Largely because India is now extremely energy deficient. According to one estimate, India is already importing 70% of its oil and gas, and this is going to go up to 85%. So India is going to become even more dependent on oil and gas. Second, India is also very deficient in key technologies. So having missed the Industrial Revolution, India hasn't quite caught up with that and still looks externally for technologies. And that really poses a major hurdle for its economic growth. Unless India can do that, it's not going to grow economically. And therefore, the globalization process and the quest for resources, food and energy, is going to be really important. But also, climate, cyber, maritime, and space are all going to be important elements for India's economic growth. The other challenge, of course, is non-proliferation and nuclear stability, since we're talking in terms of, grand strategy as well. Last but not the least are also new non-traditional challenges. This includes not just diseases, but also natural disasters, tsunamis and earthquakes, and which we've seen on the rise as well, partly because of climate change and perhaps because of other factors as well. Last but not the least, I also want to point out that India also does look at a global decision-making deficit. It's seeing a shift from a bipolar world to a multipolar world, where the decisions are being made at different areas, particularly at the UN level, where India is not a member and not an important player, particularly in the UN Security Council. And how that plays out is an important element in India's strategic thinking as well. Okay, so if these are the current challenges, how does India look at its grand strategy in the context of these challenges? Now here, I want to share with you 4 trends which largely relate to Asia, which have been presented by Professor Muthaiya Alagappa, where he talks about these 4 trends related to Asia. And the reason I flag them is that all of them are also relevant to India. First of all, Asia has certainly been liberated from the top-down Cold War dynamics. And today, the region itself has become the driver of the bottom-up approach of world order, as we've been talking over the last, two lectures or so. And key among this is the rise of China and its relationship with others, including the India-China relationship. A second is also the desire of the United States to remain a key power within Asia, right? Now the second is, and we've already seen this, the Asian security scenario will alter. In some cases, there will be a resolution of some conflicts, but there will also be an escalation in some conflicts. So this, for example, we saw in the case of India-Pakistan. Even at the end of the Cold War, there was, the conflicts and tensions between India and Pakistan rose. Third, in many other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, we have seen that economic growth has led to a decline in strategic competition. But this is not likely to be the case in Asia. In Asia, economic growth will lead to strategic competition and tensions as well, at the bilateral level, at the regional level, but also at the global level. And last but not the least, economic growth will also lead to military modernization in Asia, broadly speaking, and military force will remain a key instrument in the interaction among the major powers. Now, the reason I flag this, that although this is Asia-specific, all of this also applies to India. And that's one element that, I think it'd be important for us to keep in mind. So let me now try to conclude by drawing out 3 or 4 elements in India's kind of, strategic vision and India's strategic approach. First, India sort of looks at the world in 3 strategic circles. First is its immediate neighborhood. And these are the countries of the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, but also China, Myanmar, and Afghanistan is already a member of SAARC. Now here, India certainly seeks a primacy and veto over the actions of all the outside powers. It wants to be the principal power in this region. Okay? Second is the extended neighborhood, which I call Southern Asia. Here, which extends from Persian Gulf all the way to Strait of Malacca and from the Indian Ocean to Central Asia. Here I would also include Russia, China, and the United States as part of this neighborhood, even though the United States is not there, but it's in some ways physically present there already. And here, India seeks to balance the role of other powers. It does not see itself being a single actor in this area, but really balancing the role of other powers. Finally, at the global stage, India looks at other institutions and organizations like the United Nations, the Commonwealth, and the non-aligned movement in that sort of global arena. Both the European Union and NATO also fall in this category. And here, India really just seeks to be one of the poles in the multipolar world to play a role in global international peace and security, right? So it doesn't seek to dominate at the global level, but just wants to be one of the key players at that global level as well. The second sort of thing that we need to keep in mind is India has also very clearly shown three strategic shifts. The first is, it's moving from being a regional player to a global player. Even though strategically its focus remains its immediate region, it is now starting to build on its soft power, particularly at the global level. Second, it's moving away now from non-alignment to multi-alignment. Professor Isabel last week spoke about non-alignment 2.0, but there's very much a desire to have a strategic partnership with others. In fact, today, India has a strategic partnership with everyone except perhaps Pakistan. Even China, it has a strategic partnership. And this is another important element in India's strategic vision. It is going to be multi-aligned, not non-aligned, but multi-aligned. It's going to be partners with everyone, a friend of everyone. And the third strategic shift is India is not going to be only a military power going forward. It is really going to be a combination of a military and an economic power, and that's how it envisages its role as well, both within the region but also globally, and looking beyond and linking up in global terms as well. So to manifest this, India has really pushed to try and either join new organizations to ensure this multi-alignment. And I've just listed many of them here just to give you an idea of the variety of them. The first is the ASEAN Regional Forum, one of the first ones that India joined in 1996. BRICS, which may be very familiar to a lot of you, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. One that may be less familiar with is IPSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa. So this is a subset of BRICS, but there's one major difference. They're all democracies. And I think that's also quite deliberate, that India would choose to lead the IPSA countries to make a distinction from BRICS. Now, India is also a member of the G20 and, sees that membership is quite important for its role and particularly its economic development, but also for global governance. Then India also wants to be a member of even ad hoc, groupings like the Nuclear Suppliers Group and the Missile Technology Control Regime. But there are other equally dramatic new organizations that India is partly promoting, but India also wants to be part of. One of them is the Indian Ocean Rim Association. And I'll share with you a map which just shows you how diverse this is. But India is also not just looking at the Indian Ocean. It is also a member of the Antarctic Treaty and has very recently become an observer on the Arctic Council. So India is very much looking beyond its immediate neighborhood and region. India is also an observer on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and is also a part of the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building in Central Asia, SICA, a very small grouping that not many people know of. India is also creating sub-regional sort of hubs of cooperation, and one of them is the Bay of Bengal initiative, which has Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. So a very subgroup in a different sort of part of the world. But one element that I want to point out, here is a map of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. The point I'm trying to make here is, and the ones in dark green are the members of the Indian Ocean Rim, but the ones in light green are only observers. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, you can see how India is trying very hard to move out of its immediate neighborhood. So it's expanding its area and its partnerships beyond its immediate neighborhood. So in the Indian Ocean, India will use the IORA as its major linkages. I also want to point out two other important and interesting aspects. Pakistan is not a member of IORA, and China is only an observer, whereas the United States and France and Britain are also observers, because obviously they all have presences in the Indian Ocean, and that's the logic and the reason behind that. But the point I'm trying to make is India is expanding strategic sort of perspective going forward. So, has there been any articulation at all of India's grand vision? The only one that I found has come from the Indian Prime Minister in a speech that he made to the foreign officers at a at their annual enclave. And here, he basically outlined what I have called the new punching. And these are the 5 principles that he has talked about in terms of India's grand strategic vision. First of all, that the objective of India's foreign policy is primarily driven by India's development priorities. So the way India looks at the world is going to be through its development lens. And India would want to create a conducive world order to push for its development. That's the first principle. The second principle is that India now recognizes that its own development is absolutely linked to the world economy. It can no longer develop in isolation. It cannot develop without the help of the globalized world. Third, India can hope to create a beneficial global economy not by itself. It's not possible. Only by working with all the other major powers. And that's why you suddenly see why multi-alignment becomes more than just a philosophy. It becomes a critical strategic driver. The fourth principle is that if India wants to play a greater role at the global level, it will first have to build and ensure greater regional cooperation. And this may probably be the biggest challenge for India going forward. Last but not the least, India as a democracy, one of the things I began with, will certainly also try and promote Indian values, that of a plural, secular and liberal democracy. But it will not necessarily do this by force. So it's not going to be very keen on interventions in Libya or Syria or any future such interventions, even though it may broadly support the idea of democracy promotion. So with that and trying to wind up, where does that leave us in terms of a way forward? Until now, India has largely been a rule taker. It really followed rules which were set by other countries, by other institutions, other powers, and it simply followed along. More recently, at the end of the Cold War, India also for a period was a rule breaker. It tried to challenge the norms and institutions which did not suit its own rise. And therefore it challenged those norms and rules, and therefore it worked in terms of a rule breaker. But today, India is very conscious that the only way it's going to be able to achieve its strategic objectives is to play the role of a rule shaper. And this is that it works in partnership with other countries to build norms and build institutions where none exist at the moment. And in particular, there are 6 that I've listed, but there could be others that could be added to this list, which are absolutely vital for India's development. Climate, cyber, energy, food, maritime, and space security. But the big question is, will India actually have the will and the ability to translate this ideal and this strategic vision into a reality? It remains to be seen. I think there are both schools, the optimist and the pessimist. I probably fall in the optimist school. So let me end by saying that I think India has no choice but to remain and try to become a rule shaper. Whether it does or not remains to be seen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I'll give the floor to Isabel, but a matter of perception, looking at India's domestic issues. We talked about homegrown and imported terrorism in India. You mentioned briefly, because there were so many other things, you mentioned briefly the issues of challenge to Naxalit. But we get the feeling, looking at India, its systems, its challenges in taking on board or in implementing democracy with imported terrorisms, Maoist dissidents. As a rule shaper, there's something of a challenge, both domestically and elsewhere. Whereas if you compare with China, without underestimating the real social cohesion in China, China has a more assertive role in international as well as domestic matters. It knows it, and India, by comparison, is in the back seat, isn't it? Much less assertive than China has been for the past 10 years. You may wish to respond here now.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very pertinent sort of question, and there are maybe different ways of trying to address it. One would be that perhaps while India does have a million mutinies, the democratic system is perhaps the best way for India to deal with them. It may be long drawn out. It may be long term, but the solution then is perhaps more enduring. Because in some ways, even though the Maoists pose a critical challenge, they're also raising some very valid questions which India as a nation needs to answer. Questions like, who owns the land? And these are questions that almost every other country, developing, democratic or otherwise, have gone through. How do people who live in some of the richest lands in the world also benefit from the extraction? So that's one sort of challenge. But on the other hand, I don't know whether you saw this recent, actually very good article in The Economist, which talked about how democracy may be reaching a limit. And that one of the challenges that democracies are facing is indeed the rise of China. That China is showing an alternative model of governance, which China claims sort of works better for it, and is also much more effective in a way. My only response to that has been that perhaps that model may work for China. It's unworkable for India. And also perhaps in the short term there are these challenges, but I think in the long run the Indian model is probably going to sustain much more effectively.
Très bien. Isabelle.
Alors, moi je reviendrai, vous nous avez évoqué.
I'd like to put another question to you. During your presentation, this was very useful because people don't always think about this. You listed all these regional and other multilateral organizations of which India is a member, plus all those which India would like to promote when it does become a rule shaper. You said that there were no more than 900 Indian diplomats around the world. I mean, how will they, it seems to me that the Indians will say, well, it's not that we're not interested, but we simply haven't got anyone to set out. And Indians are always frustrated whenever the Chinese propose to have a high-level summit. They can do it in China, but they can't do it in India because the Foreign Office's budget is too low. So what kind of structural change, if India goes the multipolar way, would that bring about such changes in diplomatic levels? And indeed, would that change relations between India and the military world?
Thank you again for that excellent question. And I think certainly the numbers and wanting a bigger foreign service, people in the foreign ministry will really like what you're saying. But I think it's a more fundamental problem. I don't think it's just a question of numbers. It's also a question of how do you approach, how do you engage with the world. And if you even double or triple or even increase the size of the foreign ministry 10 times without a change in outlook, I think it would be a disaster for India. India will no more be a rule shaper. I think the whole challenge of being a rule shaper is how do you use limited numbers to work with others. But the other element is, that I very deliberately highlighted the foreign ministry, and it is small, and I think it needs to grow a little bit more. But I think it also needs a very significant attitudinal change, the outlook as well. But also, there needs to be much more coordination within the Indian establishment. Let me give you one example. Most countries have a Ministry of Energy. India has none. India has 4 ministries, 4 separate ministries, which look after the energy portfolio. Ministry of Coal, Ministry of Oil and Gas, Ministry of Power, and Ministry of Renewable Energy. And Brookings India very recently organized a symposium with the 4 secretaries of these ministries. Guess how often they had met? Never. This is the first time that they were meeting. So I think there is definitely a need and a requirement to increase the size and the capacity, but I think that, you put it very right. What is the structural change which is required? And I think that's more coordination, more a sense of the strategic vision and how everybody is working towards that, to be able to use other assets which all other countries have used, but India has not used until now. The media, the corporate sector, civil society. All of these are groups and areas that every other country has used to further their own strategic interest, not India. And this is one thing, again, I think that India needs to develop. But 900 cannot be a number that, India can work with in the 21st century. It's impossible.
Merci. Je vais passer la parole à la salle.
Thank you. I'll open the discussion to the floor now. Are there any questions, comments? Okay, 3 questions. So please use the microphone so we can record the lecture and have interpreting services. Thank you.
Presentations. I have 2 questions separated from one from the other. First of all, you listed India as an isolated democracy within its regional environment, but you also listed within the new Panchil the need for these values, democratic values, to be exported to this vicinity. But when you see the driving forces in those closed countries, Does that ring any bell? I mean, is that really a credible perspective? That's the first question. And the second one is not about strategy, but I can't resist asking your take on the next May elections. And that's also linked to the question of, you listed in terrorist organization, in the particular case of the IM, the Indian Mujahideen, which is staunchly against Modi and the prospect of Modi being elected. So, according to it, how does it link up with the IM strategy? Thank you.
Monsieur?
Sir?
Absolutely fascinating. I'm wondering, influence of the Indian diaspora all throughout the world, because we seem to see the Chinese using quite a lot this Chinese influence, especially in Africa, where Indian had a very big influence all through of Africa. Do you think that has an impact as well in the region? Because when you travel around, there's a lot of business done by Indians. They're very strong in that.
Il y a eu une question de François Nicolo.
There's a question by François Nicolo here. François? I thought your lecture was fascinating, and I would like to shine the spotlight on a few points that I don't think were sufficiently developed. First of all, if over its long history, India was a civilization that went well beyond its current territory, India as a political unity is a recent phenomenon. There were a few empires, but they were all brief, and they hardly spanned or covered the whole current Indian territory. Regarding the two-nation theory, you said the Muslim League led by Jinnah was up against a movement that wanted to gather everyone together in a secular state. But the truth is, at the time, there was a radical Hindu movement, which was actually frightening for the Muslims. And this radical Hindu movement assassinated Gandhi. It was people from this movement, and there's an undercover current that sometimes surfaces and that is still present nowadays every now and again. And this leads me to India's major problem, because the underlying idea in your lecture is that India is focused first and foremost on its own problems before it looks towards or it turns towards the outside world. And one of these major issues, and it's certainly a great pleasure to see Indian elections. It's an incredible time to see this giant democracy expressing its will. Microphone, please. Microphone, please. But there is this problem of religious conflict. And if I may say so, the population issue is an issue. Is it an asset? Is it a drawback? When India became independent, it had 300 million inhabitants, and in 2 generations, in 2 times 30 years, it was multiplied by 4. India does perceive this as an issue, and it's an issue that is still something India must address, so I'd like to hear you on that. Okay, big fish here. I'll let you answer.
Again, excellent set of questions, and I'm really always enriched and grateful for them. I think I'll try and address them in 2 ways. The first is, maybe I'll try and take some of the external dimensions and then sort of look at the domestic one, because I think a lot of them are related to the domestic politics, which is entirely understandable. Indian diaspora. I think, I would say the Indian diaspora until recently was seen negatively. When I say recently, I mean literally the last 10, 15 years. Because if you looked at, for example, the Sikh movement and the Sikh uprising, the Tamil uprising in Sri Lanka, even Kashmir to a large extent, this was largely driven by diasporas. Funding was raised there. It was very much a linkage. Looking back at the homeland, it was tied up with issues of identity and other dimensions. But that was the critical element. But only recently has the Indian government looked at the diaspora as a possible asset. Now, and I think it's come both ways. One, the Indian government looking at that. So now every year there's a Pravasi Divas, which means, Indian residents all over the world. They come, they're feted, they're given awards. And India has been able to really now start to plug in to this diaspora. And it varies, of course, from country to country. But certainly in the United States, they've done very well. The Indian diaspora has done very well. And, India has been able to plug into them extremely well, much better than in other parts as well. So I think now it is more and more of a good news story where you're going to see the diaspora starting to play a greater role. Of course, a comparison with China is inevitable, but, one of the reasons why you don't see the Indian diaspora running in to India is because it's very difficult to invest in India, even today, which is why, ironically, a lot of Indians are investing outside. One of the reasons why, an Indian-led businessman, although he's more European now, bought Arcelor, was not because it's only one of the best, plants in the world, but because, it's much more difficult to invest in India. So it's a strange irony that on the one hand, the diaspora has that capacity and they probably would be willing to, but the wherewithal, the capacity and, the natural basis is not there in India to support that at the moment. And once that changes, then you can see a greater engagement with the diaspora to bring sort of stuff back into India. All right. I'll sort of end with the May elections because I think this is kind of building up to that in a way. But let me talk a little bit about the democracy promotion. If I understood your question correctly, it was why did India not try to promote democracy in its immediate neighborhood?
It was not that. It was given that it looked as crucial to disseminate in the city. When you see the driving forces that are opening anti-democratic around India,
right?
In that prospect, you listed a
realistic one around. Yeah. Again, I think India broadly does believe in the value, and that's right. That's probably the last of the Panchi. India does broadly believe in the value of, its model having worked for him, working for others as well in terms of the liberal democracy. But let's be clear. I think India is also realist enough that, particularly in its own neighborhood, that it's willing to do deals and even compromise on its values if it sees that that's in its national interest. It has done that in the past. And certainly in its immediate neighborhood, it goes to bed with authoritarian regimes when it suits its purpose. It's quite interesting, for example, when you look at India's response to Nepal. India, at one level, is actually very comfortable with a monarchy because, it was one institution you knew well and you could deal with them. In fact, India was much slower in supporting the uprising. It was very nervous about the Maoists, even though the Maoists had nothing to do with China. They just took on that name. They were much more indigenous. There was a great concern and suspicion about, how they were likely to play out. So certainly, I think India has been able to, use its own interests and keep values aside in its immediate neighborhood. That's certainly likely to be. But then, India is not the only exception in that game. Almost everybody, every other country has done a similar thing in its immediate areas of interest. To look at that. Let me start with the notion of the two-nation theory, because I think it's a very good segue to build up into this whole conversation we're going to have, and end with the May elections, if I might. Of course, Ambassador, you're absolutely right about the radical Hindu movement. It has always been a big challenge. But, this is the challenge of India. It had the radical right, it had the radical left, it has radicals of all colors. But yet, I would say that the one saving grace, and I'm afraid I didn't get much of a chance to talk about this, has been the Indian Constitution. The Indian Constitution has provided that space for these groups to exist, but also to keep them in check. Which is why, it's quite an interesting phenomenon where in other parts of the world, in the 30s and the 40s, where communism was such an attractive ideology, and it was in India too, in some parts, that India was the first country where the communists were elected to power. In the state of Kerala, even before Allende's Chile. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that yes, there are all of these radical movements, but the Constitution allows for them to participate in the political structure, in the political process through the Constitution. There is that. Now, does it allow for the domination of a single entity or a majority? Of course not. The Constitution would not, no Constitution would do that. And that, I think, is the strength and the vision of the Indian Constitution. How it's functioning, how it's operationalized is a different issue. Absolutely. So I think from that point of view, I totally agree that, certainly in 1947, the Hindu radical was a major threat, was a major concern. And I think, I would concede to Jinnah the point of whether he thought that the Indian National Congress could manage the radical right. That's a fair concern in 1947. Unfortunately, I think Jinnah's been proved wrong. The radical have been managed. They've been managed through, the role of the judiciary, the role of, the legislature, and really this sort of division of labor and the Constitution. Again, I sort of keep coming back to that. So I think that's an important sort of element to keep in mind going forward. And again, if you look at how minorities have done in, say, let's talk about India and Pakistan, there's no comparison. Since the time, and this comes to your population question, since the time of independence, India's Muslim population has actually grown. For India to become the second largest at one point and the third largest Muslim population country in the world. In contrast, in Pakistan, although Pakistan never claimed to be a secular country, the size of the minorities has actually shrunk. And the kind of threats that are posed on minorities, of course there are similar concerns in India as well, are much more existential in Pakistan than they are, in India. At one point of time, by the way, the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the uber radical Hindu right, they've had a very rough history with the Indian Constitution. This movement has been banned 3 times in India, not outside, in India, by the Indian Constitution and the Indian judiciary. So, that's another kind of driver which is going to go forward. One point you made about the population. I think the population is both an asset and a liability. I think the Indian population at the moment is a huge asset because it is so young. It really is, at one level, really, and it's not. It's a population which is really engaged with the world, which has a very different outlook. It's a very globalized population in many ways. But the big liability is two. Number one, I talked about the gender inequality ratio. That's terrible in India. I mean, there are some states, actually very close to New Delhi, Haryana, where there are villages where there are no women. They now actually have to go out to get women to marry. And by the way, it does not improve the standing of the woman. It doesn't, unfortunately. So on the one hand, you've got a very skewed gender ratio. And again, it's not all over, but in some parts of India, it's really much worse. Second is if your economy doesn't grow at a certain level and you cannot provide jobs, suddenly a youth population becomes a ticking time bomb. So it's very much a double-edged sort of sword. Now, with that, let me turn to the elections in May. I think, the one thing is a lot of people are saying that it seems like a Modi wave, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of numbers have been bandied around. But let me make two predictions which, whatever the outcome, will be absolutely accurate, right? One of them is whoever comes to power, it will be a coalition. It will be a coalition. The only question is, how big is the coalition going to be? This last one, by the way, was 24 parties. The one before that was 18. The one before that was only 14. So, and by the way, you've also had minority governments, which have managed to survive with outside support, et cetera, et cetera. So, with that assumption, two or three things become very clear. One, let's assume for a minute that it is a Modi prime ministership, right? First of all, Modi's quote-unquote success has come in a state where he was a majority. He was the only party. The Congress was there, but it was in opposition. He was never part of a coalition, number one. Number two, so by that logic, at the national level, when you're working with a coalition, it's going to be very, very different, extremely different. And that is going to determine, how you're able to perform and function. Second, it depends on the number of seats that you get. Now, the magic number of seats in the Indian Parliament are 272, right? Because that will give you majority in 543 seat house. No party, not even the Modi wave, is expecting 272. Even their best scenario does not give them 272, right? So the big question is going to be how many numbers do they get? And that will determine how the formation of the government, who the other parties are going to become involved, et cetera, et cetera. There is a third, but having said that, I still think this election is probably going to be the most significant one in perhaps decades, if not, in the history of India, for two reasons. Number one, until now, the Indian elections have been very clearly prime ministerial elections, right? So the elections are fought on the part of parties. Very rarely do the prime minister candidates reveal themselves before the elections. That happens only around or after the elections. That has not been the case with Modi. Modi has declared himself to be, the candidate even before the party had decided. and this led to, so he's running the election like a presidential campaign, not a parliamentary campaign. So that's already a very interesting shift in division that you're starting to see. The third is, and this is a new phenomenon called the Common Man Party, the Aam Aadmi Party. They surprised a lot of people in New Delhi when they emerged victorious and got more seats than anybody had anticipated, and now they have national ambitions. They may not be very, very significant in numbers, but even a few numbers in a coalition can make a lot of difference as well. Last but not the least, that I think there are notions that if Modi will come to power, he will be unfettered in his approach and being an action man, and that's not clear because within his own support groups there are major disagreements, particularly on foreign direct investment. So, if one is expecting the economic reforms to get a boost, that may not necessarily happen either. And last but not the least, I would not, put anybody into the Prime Minister's house right now because of one very significant group, and that is the Indian voter. The Indian voter always has the ability to surprise. And the Indian voter may still surprise everyone in the May elections.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions dans la
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? The three last questions. 3 hands raised, so you'll have to come back next time. You've been here a few times, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of interesting questions. You quite justly raised the issue of the importance of maritime space and of seaborne trade. But India lacks deep water ports. Most of the traffic to India goes through Colombo, I believe. So how do you think this situation will be changed in the near future? And my second question is, you have to protect maritime communication channels, which means you need a navy, and your navy has been facing challenges with all these serious incidents that have happened lately, and I would like to hear you on that. My last question, to remain in the water, is a word you did not use, and it is the term water. I mean drinking water. And water is a capital element for all countries throughout the world, but for your country even more because you are overpopulated, and I do know you have water issues internally, and you have water issues with your neighbors like China. So I would like to hear you on that as well. Thank you very much. I would also like to ask a question about India's maritime strategy. We've seen China's maritime strategy recently, an aggressive reconquering of an economic zone it considers its economic zone, taking control of streets for its supply circuit, a competitive policy. De facto, I think the Indian strategy is more cooperative, but what are its targets and what is its vision of this cooperation with the major fleets that are crossing through or that exist in the Indian Ocean? I have a much more minor question. I've always been surprised by something in the BRICS. On the one hand, there's Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa, which have all successfully hosted major sports events, Olympic Games or World Football Cup, and they've ended up in the spotlight. And India has never tried to do this. Is it cultural? Does it have to do with sports? Does it have to do with resources, with funding? There's strategy everywhere, even in sports. Sure. Your lecture was fascinating, but you sparked a completely insane hope in me as I was listening to you. You mentioned soft power, and my question is, what is today's India's leadership position on this issue? Do Indian leaders still want to promote this element as India's historical and cultural legacy? And could this radically transform international relationships? Can we preserve these qualities even when India has completely risen? Thank you, sir. We will let you answer and conclude along with Isabella if she has anything to add. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, let me start with the maritime questions, that since they've got the maximum amount of linkage there. I mean, India certainly has geographical limits. That's a challenge. But in the 21st century, those challenges should be less difficult to address. You can dredge, you can build artificial deep water ports, you can look beyond. There are all kinds of things that you can do, but it's really a question of capacity. If you need that, then you can certainly, go in that way. I'm glad you raised the question about the Navy, because in some ways, and this is why the reason I mentioned the budget. In the budget, the Indian Navy still only gets 15% of the total budget. There is a move to try and move it to about at least 20%. And even that would be a significant move, but the Army is resisting all the way. I think in some ways, the Indian Navy, and this comes to your question about the strategy, really has a two-pronged strategy, right? One is, and you'll see the evolution in this strategy. The initial strategy was an incredibly insular, almost brown water Navy, limited strategy where India in the 70s in particular, 60s and 70s, constantly challenged the presence of non-littoral countries in the Indian Ocean. France, Britain, particularly the United States, and to some extent even Russia. But now it's very interesting. You see an immediate sort of shift. So the first element is India is very deliberately building towards the Blue Water Navy. It's got a long way to go, long way to go, but it's moving in that direction. Number two, India historically has always had an element of sea control. Even when it had a very small navy, the effort was to have a sea control aircraft carriers. You had sea denial as well, whereas China, it's been the other way around. It began with sea denial and then is now trying to build up a sea control capability. And, my friends in the Navy tell me that, if you're serious about maritime aviation, it takes you at least one generation to get it right. And the Russians never got it right, by the way, despite many attempts. And so that's one area that, certainly you can see India sort of building up on in terms of the aircraft carrier capability as well. But having said that, Professor Gautier, you mentioned absolutely the right point. I think India's approach is very much going to be cooperative, to work with other navies, at a very minimum to keep the lines of trade and communication open, the sea lines open. So that's going to be a very, very critical element, which is why India has been at the forefront of counter-piracy. Both in the Strait of Malaccas, where it worked with the United States, but also off the coast of Somalia, where it worked with China, by the way. And that's an interesting sort of dimension as well. Does India see itself, taking on a more forceful enforcement capability vis-a-vis the other navies in particular? The former Navy chief who resigned at the end of all of these tragedies and accidents thought so, that he had the capability, or the Navy was moving in that direction. But I don't think the Navy is quite ready yet. And that brings me to the question of the series of accidents that are happening. I think this is in some ways indicative of a Navy which is expanding rather than contracting. The question may be it's expanding too fast and therefore is taking more risks. And that's why that's part of the problem, I think, going forward. But I'm less concerned about its ability to develop and grow, because it would inevitably have to do that. But in the long run, I think, if you look at, and here it's interesting to draw parallels vis-a-vis China, because they are interesting parallels. The first cut on the Chinese development of the Navy was very much sea denial, particularly in the context of Taiwan. There you could see, so they had carrier killer missiles, etc., etc. But only now is the Chinese Navy starting to expand and move into a sea control mode. India, doesn't necessarily have that sea denial sort of notion, because there are, the only strategic interests are to make sure that everybody can trade. That's the objective, the primary sort of objective. So there isn't, a sea denial sort of reservation. It's more a desire to have a sea control sort of notion going forward. And again, in a cooperative sort of way. But a question mark does remain vis-a-vis China, and particularly the South China Sea. How that's going to play out, because clearly, as the South China Sea is evolving, the more confrontational it becomes, ASEAN is certainly out of the question. They do not have a capacity, even collectively, to address the Chinese Navy. So who does? As of now, the United States. But would the United States really want to take on that challenge? I mean, they've said no, right? So which are the other navies left there? And would India then be willing to step into that area? Now, having said all of that, I think the underlying approach for India is going to be to support and empower the laws of the sea. And there, I think India needs to do more as a rule shaper to make sure that, countries which are outside of the law of the sea, by the way, like the United States, should be part of it, so that you can strengthen the principles of the law of the sea, which, by the way, the United States supports. So I think that may be one important element going forward. Your question on BRICS and sporting events. Well, actually, India did hold one. It was called the Commonwealth Games. Slightly smaller, not of the same caliber, I grant you. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster not because the games went wrong. I think the games finally went well. But there was so much corruption in the run-up to that, India actually got kicked out of the International Olympic Association because of that. That process has only just got back on. So that's there's no explanation for that. Simply to say that strategic linkage and vision is missing. Among the leadership, because you need a certain degree of vision to look at it in that way, that sports is also strategic. And this brings me to your excellent question about soft power. So I would begin with the sports analogy, that even if you do not have that, then, what is the kind of soft power that you're trying to promote today? Now, I don't want to end on a pessimist note at all. So I will say that there is a new soft power in the 21st century that India can and has and will contribute to, right? And that is the ability of its manpower, its expertise. Forget Indians in India. Look around the world. Look at the corporate world. Look at the United Nations. Look at other institutions. Look at who the people are who are in various management and other positions. A lot of them tend to be Indians. And I don't think they're there, because India is promoting them. I think they're there despite India not promoting them. And I think this has to do with the recognition. The irony is India has some of the best training institutes and others in the world. What it doesn't have is enough strategic linkages with other training institutions or educational institutions like the University of Paris, for example. And I think that's an important element to sort of bridge, But part of it may also have to do with openness and closeness of some countries and societies. But I think inevitably, as you look, as the global economy globalizes, and you look out for the best talent rather than the national talent, you'll see a greater surge of this expertise. And that's the kind of soft power that India will bring to bear. I'll give you another instance in this, just, for example, which kind of underlines that. India suddenly discovered when there was piracy going on that a large number of the crew who were being kidnapped were Indians. Now, India didn't realize that. Now it turns out something like 35 to 40% of the people working in various ships or flagships, right, any other flag, are actually Indians. So, that's the kind of expertise that I'm talking about, which may exist out there and, which needs to be perhaps made aware of. And that's the sort of soft power that I see India sort of providing. That and providing ideas on how to shape new regimes and institutions going forward. Thank you.
Isabelle, alors un dernier mot avant de...
Isabelle, would you like to conclude? Well, it's difficult because I will be going far and fast. You just mentioned soft power. You said you were an optimist. So let me go back to Shining India. You said the Indian space program isn't about space power, it's about being a space player, and I think that's a very interesting distinction. This space program was developed with the idea of getting India out of underdevelopment and making India a major power. And now with the Mars project, a capability or an ambition has been demonstrated as a major international space player. But India is also about becoming more strategic, about going beyond development, beyond civilian aspects. Let me be very brief. Would you say that the space program nowadays is an emblem, an icon of India in the way it sees itself as a major global player through cooperation, because the space program involves cooperation with many other actors, but it was also a national ambition of attracting new incomers? I know it's a broad issue I'm raising, but I'm sure you'll be able to sum it up.
I think, first of all, I would entirely agree with you that the approach that India followed, and certainly, this would not have been possible without the support of countries like France, but others as well, was very, very different. It was very much looking at how does it benefit the farmers, how does it benefit the poorest people, and it was very radical for its time and in its way. Now I would say that that capability has certainly started to mature, and it is certainly providing much more wherewithal at the global level, not just at the Indian level as well. And now the question which comes to mind is whether India is getting into prestige projects. I think some element of that is inevitable, but I don't think India has still gone entirely down that route. For example, the ultimate prestige project is to put a man on the moon, or human endeavor, etc., etc. I think that's the wrong approach, because you can do so much in space without wasting your time and money and effort in trying to put people. This is the ultimate human ego sort of ride, and I think so far India has resisted that temptation. It's done, and the interesting thing is, as you rightly pointed out, even when it does the moon shot, the Chandrayaan, or the Mars shot, it tries to justify it in development terms. And I think this is the uniqueness of the Indian program, that it will have to keep tying and doing that. So hopefully that will prevail, because I don't think India can afford prestige issues, prestige projects. So,
merci beaucoup, Paul. Merci vraiment pour cette conférence.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for this conference. We will all be very pleased to see you again on April 10th. Next time we start a new conference cycle with John Krieg from Atlanta, the University of Atlanta, and the lecture will be held at the military school in the Louis Conference Hall, so please remember to sign up ahead of time on the website of our military school, and we will be focusing on technological issues and transatlantic dialogue on these matters. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pal, and see you next time.